All right, today we're digging into a story about rebellion, royalty, and really the very nature of history itself. We're going way back, 2,000 years, to meet two women who became absolute legends, with a story that still echoes right into the modern day.
So get this image in your head, because it's the heart of the whole legend. It's this epic, totally David and Goliath scene. You've got two noble women from a subjugated territory leading an army from the backs of war elephants against the insane might of China's Han Dynasty. I mean, it sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel, right? But the thing is, it really happened.
And that's really the core question we're going to explore. We'll look at who Trưng Trắc and her sister Trưng Nhị actually were, what drove them to rebel, and, just as important, how their story has been told and retold over the centuries, turning them into these incredibly powerful national symbols. Okay, so to really get why the sisters rebelled, we have to understand the world they were born into. It was a place where two very different cultures were just colliding.
This timeline gives us the basic framework. You can see that by the time the Trunk sisters were born, their homeland had been under Han Chinese rule for well over a century. So they were born into a world of occupation, inheriting this long history of local lords governing under the watchful eye of a foreign empire.
Now, what's so fascinating here is the fundamental cultural clash. The Vietnamese society back then was just remarkably different from the super rigid patriarchy of their rulers. We're talking a world where women could inherit property, they could hold positions of power, they could lead. This whole social structure made the idea of female generals and queens not just possible, but kind of natural, a concept that was almost unthinkable in Han China at the time.
So, we've got the backdrop, right? Long-term occupation and a major clash of cultures. But what was the specific thing that finally lit the fuse? Well, this is where the story gets really compelling, because the historical record, it isn't exactly straightforward.
On this part, pretty much all the sources agree. The Han-appointed governor, a guy named Su Ding, was your classic tyrant. He was greedy, oppressive, and was systematically tearing down the traditional rights and privileges of the local Vietnamese nobility. He was slapping on heavy taxes and just fueling this widespread resentment. The political pressure was definitely building.
A tyrant and an oppressed people. That sets the stage for sure. But history often turns on a single personal moment. And in the story of the Trung sisters, the nature of that spark is the first major place where the legend and the historical records really start to diverge.
This is the version you'll probably hear most often. And it's a powerful, personal story, right? A grieving widow turning her sorrow into this righteous fury. In this telling, the rebellion is an act of love and vengeance, a wife taking up arms to honor her murdered husband.
But here's the crucial point. That popular story might actually be a later invention. Historians think that as Vietnamese society became more influenced by patriarchal Confucian values, the idea of a woman starting a war for political reasons, well, it became kind of uncomfortable. But a wife avenging her husband? That was a much more acceptable motive. In contrast, the earliest Chinese sources claim Trưng Trắc herself was the revolutionary, furious about Su Ding's tyranny, and that her husband was her supporter, not her cause.
So whatever the exact trigger was, the result was absolutely astonishing. In the year 40 AD, Trưng Trắc and Trưng Nhị rallied the local lords and peasants. Their campaign was just a whirlwind of success, sweeping through the Red River Delta and capturing dozens of Chinese forts with unbelievable speed. They actually drove Governor Su Ding out completely.
And their victory wasn't just some brief triumph. It kicked off 3 whole years of self-rule, a short but brilliant period where the sisters established their own independent kingdom.
In the wake of their victory, Trưng Trắc was declared queen, with her sister Trưng Nhị as her co-ruler and top general. And this was a monumental moment. She wasn't just a rebel leader anymore. She was now the first woman to ever reign as a monarch over the Vietnamese people.
And their agenda was crystal clear. Their rule was a systematic reversal of Chinese influence. They immediately got rid of those awful taxes. They brought back their traditional laws and customs. And, staying true to their cultural roots, they filled their government and their army with female leaders, including their own mother. This was a total restoration of their world.
3 years of independence was a remarkable achievement, but, well, they had just poked one of the world's great superpowers. The Han Empire was not going to let this challenge stand, and what happened next would seal not only their fate, but their legend.
The imperial response was slow, but it was massive. The Han court sent one of its most celebrated generals, Ma Yuan, a veteran of the northern frontiers. He commanded a professional army of over 20,000 soldiers in a fleet of 2,000 ships. An absolutely overwhelming force was now headed straight for the sisters' new kingdom. The sisters' army, which was mostly made up of local militia, was brave, for sure, but ultimately no match for the seasoned, well-equipped imperial legions. Ma Yuan was a methodical and brilliant tactician. The decisive battle was a total catastrophe for the Vietnamese forces, and the sisters were forced to flee.
So their rebellion was over, but how did it end for them personally? Well, just like with the spark of the rebellion, their final moments are another point where history becomes a battle of narratives. It's a choice between two very, very different endings.
The Vietnamese tradition tells a story of heroic martyrdom. They're cornered, facing capture, so the sisters choose to preserve their honor by taking their own lives in a river, an act of ultimate defiance. But the Chinese historical accounts? They tell a much grimmer story, that they were caught, beheaded, and their heads were sent back to the Han capital, like trophies of imperial victory. You see, one story is about national honor, the other is about imperial power.
And this really gets to the heart of why their story is so compelling. As these historians point out, the narratives we have today are often shaped by what people needed the story to be. For a nation that was under foreign rule for centuries, a story of defiant martyrdom is just way more inspiring than one of brutal execution.
So you can really see the evolution here. It starts as a real historical rebellion. That becomes a powerful story of hope. Over centuries, that story gets formalized, with emperors building temples in their honor, making them almost like divine figures. And then, in the 20th century, they're reborn as modern symbols of resistance against colonial powers. Their legend just grew and grew, far beyond the actual events of 43 AD.
And the story of the Trưng sisters really leaves us with this powerful question. They were undoubtedly real women who led an absolutely incredible rebellion. But their legacy is also a testament to the power of storytelling, and a reminder that the history we inherit is often a blend of fact and the enduring myths a nation tells about itself.